I'd like to include a little addendum to Duff's story, if I may. And it has to do with Corky. Because Corky told the story as well at the Kootenay Storytelling Festival in Procter. He told the story of Ginger Goodwin as well. His title was The Murder of Ginger Goodwin. And he was using very much the same facts and some embellishment that Duff didn't have in his story. And some of them may have been factual or not, I'm not sure, but it was very interesting and quite wonderful. But the way he ended his story was a little different in that he told the story of how in the 90s, whenever it was, when he was the Minister of Transportation and Highways, Glenn Clark told him to name a highway after Ginger Goodwin. And he did. He went out there, he told the story, he went out there, it was raining with a crew of highways guys, and they put up a sign somewhere near Cumberland on Vancouver Island. And they named this piece of highway Ginger Goodwin Way. And it stayed that way until the current government got elected. And as soon as the Liberals came into power, another crew went out and took the sign down. So there was, for a few short years, there was a Ginger Goodwin Way, which was a BC highway, and it no longer exists. It exists, it was similar to those things that, many other things about, like his medical records and how his exemption from the draft, there were documents disappeared. It's just another one of those disappearing of a little piece of history that was created by political powers. And so that's just another little thing to chew on. I think it's important to understand that in a way, is part of the story as well.
Do you know where the sign is?
I don't.
Ask Gordon.
Ask Gordon.
We can put it back.
Ask Gordon Campbell.
Yeah. That's right. Go back.
So I'd like to take you back to about the year 1900. And it's a place called Fairview Camp in the South Okanagan. And it was the time when the land had been settled for the past few decades and even longer by mostly English people coming channeled through eastern Canada or the States, and many Chinese people who came as laborers on the railroads. And there were also a lot of native people who were here long before any of the others had come. But this story is about one man. He came from more the British tradition of the settlers. It's a man named Henry Irwin. He was born in the late 1850s, I think it was 1859, in the Wicklow Mountains of Ireland. And he went to the normal public school system there. His father was the incumbent priest, the Anglican priest in his village. His grandfather was a deacon, and his great-grandfather was the archdeacon of Emly. So a very... Could I have some water, please? Oh. I drank a bunch before I came out. So he was kind of grown up in that, he had that church feeling about him already when he was still a boy. And I started in the Okanagan with this story because that was his last position as a minister in the Church of England. And he was in this Okanagan, this Fairview Camp it was called. And Bishop Dart at the time had seen and heard from other people, had seen himself how tired the Reverend Henry Irwin was, and how worn, and how his face was kind of a mask of sadness, and which even in spite of his naturally cheery disposition, just couldn't be hidden, that mask of sadness and tiredness. And he called him to the diocesan center in Westminister, for this was the diocese of New Westminster and Kootenay. So, and it was an area of land about the size of France with about 100,000 people in at the time. And he suggested to the Reverend Irwin that he go back to his native island for a rest. But he refused. He wasn't the type of man, if he hit a few stones while he was plowing his field, that he would give up. He continued his ministry and politely refused to take the rest that the bishop suggested. A few months later, he suggested it again, and I think finally probably ordered it, that he go back to Ireland for a rest. And so in late 1901, he boarded a train to go to Montreal to catch a steamer back to Ireland. But this is a Kootenays story. So I'd like to go back a little further and find out and describe to you who this man was, Henry Irwin. I told you where he was born already. He was educated in the public system. And when he was 12, he went to St. Columba's School in Dublin, which was kind of the Irish Eton of the time. And had the backing of many notable bishops in Ireland. So it was a very upstanding school. And the thing that he was noted most for was his athleticism. He was a fine scholar, but he never reached that pinnacle of scholarship that many who studied in those kinds of schools did. And his name isn't on the roster of the great scholars, but it's on every team name in that school. Soccer, football, rugby, cricket, rowing, boxing. His name was on every list of all the sports and all the schools that he ever attended. And his younger brother told later in his life, as somebody was doing some research on him, said, oh yes, he was always engaging in the manly exercises to harden his body for missionary work that was part of his vision of his own life. For he was, even as a boy, he had always said that he wanted to go and be a missionary in a cold land. So, he finished his education, got an ordinary degree, it was called, and he went to Yarlett Boys' School. And he made more of an impression on the men than on the boys there, the priests and the other teachers. Because of his noble spirit, it said that he taught the men far more than he did the boys. Not that he didn't teach the boys well, but his character, his upright character, his nobility of spirit was how many people put it at the time. That everybody learned from Henry Irwin, just for the person he was. And he would never allow any bullying. And he'd always stand up for the underdog. And any kind of question of integrity was brought to him for judgment, even though he was a young man. And he was there for only a year and a half. But it wasn't really a surprise because nobody expected him to stay. It was too mild a challenge for such a strong, spirited young man. Then he went to the theological school and studied to be a priest. And he completed that, and finally in the early 1880s, he was ordained as a priest in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And his wish was granted. He was sent to the Diocese of New Westminster and Kootenay in British Columbia. And the Bishop Silito at the time, his first posting that he gave him was in Kamloops. It was a railroad town. The new railroad had just come through there, or was just coming through there. And it was a place where the rail workers and the miners didn't necessarily take kindly to a well-dressed European gentleman who was suddenly in their midst, and he didn't always have an easy go of things. You know, he would be teased because of his clerical clothing, or he would be scoffed at, but his was such a powerful personal integrity of spirit that he would never take offense at anything that was directed at him. And there was one story from Kamloops where he was surrounded by 3 ruffians, hard rock miners apparently, on a drinking spree. And they were teasing him and making fun of him, and he of course laughed it off, as was his wont. And so they changed their tack a little bit, and they started insulting the church and the Lord Christ and God himself. And so this was a point where he had to make a stand, and he asked that they apologize. And one burly fellow stood over him thinking he could just scare off Father Pat, as he was known because of his Irish ancestry. A name he picked up while he was in England from his English friends. Well, a couple of quick, well-placed punches, and that burly fellow was measuring his length out on the ground, and Father Pat was kneeling beside him saying, "Forgive me, Father, for not telling him I was a champion boxer at Oxford." So the others went on their way, and it was just a an indication of how, and this was when he was a very young man. And another quick story of the same time. They looked at his dress. They thought, oh, surely such a well-dressed is a milksop was the word they used, a weakling. Look at the way he's dressed. He's so small. He wasn't a large man. And so they asked him if he could ride a horse. And he had spent his childhood on a shaggy pony exploring the area where he lived, and he could ride very well, and it was a skill that was to serve him very well in his time in Canada, in British Columbia. And but they didn't tell him that the horse that they were going to give him was a so-called buck jumper that wouldn't, those wild creatures that wouldn't allow anybody to stay on its back. And he was thrown hard, twice. And as he tried to get on the horse the third time, they realized that anybody who would get back onto the horse, such a horse, is certainly no milksop, and he gained a lot of respect that way. It was also in Kamloops that he met Miss Frances Stewart Innes. She was a young lady of good church family whose sister was already married to a priest, and things looked pretty promising between them, but it would be another 4 years before they would marry, because Father Pat accepted a position in the little village of Donald on the other side of the mountains towards Golden. And he worked the railroad camps. He was a missionary in the railroad camps up and down the line. And he wasn't known as a good preacher. He wasn't known as a powerful speaker. He delivered sound church doctrine, clothed in simple words, but it was his ability to bring together the community that was his real strength, his ability to get people to work on communal projects. He had a church built in Donald, which is a story all of its own for another time. And his ministry took him all the way down the Arrow Lake. It took him to the mining camps in Nelson in the 1880s. And it took him wherever his horse would carry him. He apparently wrote home one time saying that the last year and a half were a wonderful year and a half, most of it in the saddle. So he was known to average about 1,200 miles every 6 weeks on horseback in his mission work. And he was also known for his incredible courage. And the Rogers Pass there weren't as many snow sheds as there are right now, and the railroad was coming through there. And there were a lot of avalanches. And while he was in Donald, he was called to an accident. There was an avalanche, and a snowplow driver, Mr. Green, was killed. And Mrs. Green couldn't stand the thought of having her husband's body out there in the snow. So Father Pat went out on snowshoes with a toboggan, and it took him 2 days and a night. But he came back with the body of Mr. Green and delivered it to his family. So, and that was an almost typical scene of the kind of thing that he did. Well, the years rolled on, and he worked very hard. He went back to Ireland for a while when he heard that his father was ill, and he actually took over his ministry for 2 years in the village where he grew up after his father died. But he still wanted to be in Canada, and he was not married yet at this time. So he finished the 2 years there. His duty to his family was done, and to his homeland, and he went back. And while he was gone, also the Bishop Sillitoe, who was his bishop in New Westminster, he also died. So there was a great void in his heart. His family, his father died. His almost father figure of the bishop had also died in the meantime. And so when he came back, he asked for a position in a really, really remote, and not that Kamloops and Donald weren't remote, but he was stationed in the village of Rossland in 1896. Now try to imagine Rossland in 1896, about 6,000 souls, 50 saloons, many houses of prostitution, and
Just like today.
and it wasn't a pretty place. But he wasn't there for beauty, he was there for work. And he took it on with an amazing tenacity and love for humanity. It's actually where his real love of humanity shone and developed. And but there's there's a reason also for this sadness that was in his eyes, you know, because there was another chapter of his life that was just before Rossland. And it was one of the reasons for that sadness, besides the great loss of people who were really close to him. He did finally marry Miss Frances Innes. And he had a short time where he was in Westminster, in the cathedral there. He was the assistant priest in the cathedral and the secretary to the bishop. And it was a wonderful time for them. They had a small house and a garden and all that wonderful time of youth and love and ultimately pregnancy and at one point in the fall after a choral society meeting, his wife wasn't feeling well and labor began. And something went terribly wrong, and the baby was born dead. And the Reverend Irwin and Mrs. Irwin, of course, were crushed by this tragedy. And then terribly again, 3 days later, everybody thought that she was okay, but she suddenly also took ill and died. And he lived with the bishop for a while after that, and then carried on out into the wilds. And there he really realized what his calling was. He knew that the rest of his life would be one of celibacy and service to the church. He knew that he would never find the love that he had and lost. And his duty to his family was also over, to his family in Ireland. So he dedicated himself entirely to the church and to the men he called his boys. And these were the miners. He would preach in Rossland. He would preach to his congregation to say that people are good. People are basically good and can be trusted, especially if they're wearing overalls and work boots. That was one of his favorite lines. He's rather beware of people wearing kid gloves and perfumed clothes. So he was a real supporter of the working man. And he was known for his reckless charity, it was called, because he would often give away his clothes. And one time his congregation was scandalized at the threadbare jacket, winter coat that he was wearing, and so they got together a donation box and raised enough money to buy him a new coat. But sure enough, a few days later, some hard luck miner was seen prospecting in the hills around Rossland wearing Father Pat's coat. And when questioned about it, he said, well, this poor man had no coat at all, and I couldn't give him my old one, could I? And he joked with friends while out on a walk one time that he saw a scarecrow, and if I changed hats with him, it would have been, the switch would have been to his advantage. He was still a fine athlete, even well into his 30s and mid-30s and into his late 30s when he was in Rossland. And he would often walk the 2-day walk from Rossland to Grand Forks over the Dewdney Trail. He would walk it in one day and go and hold a service and come back the next day. And he would also walk to Northport, to Colville, where he was licensed by an American bishop to have services across the line in Washington State. And still, he would meet up the odd time with somebody who didn't take kindly to preachers or to somebody in such unusual clothing, or perhaps it was jealousy or for whatever reason. And another case like that was when he heard of a miner out in a cabin, sick, very sick, 30 miles away from town, and no doctor to go there. So he himself, he gathered up some medicines and he set out on foot on the 30-mile walk to where this miner was known to be ailing. And he met up with a few of his friends on horseback, a few of the miner's friends. And they said that their friend Bill doesn't need a parson, he needs a doctor, and he should turn around and go back to town. Well, apparently, Father Pat unhorsed 2 of them and carried on along his way and went and visited Bill in the cabin and ministered to him and gave him the medicines, and it was a successful visit. And on his way out, those 3 miners were waiting for him because they didn't like the way this had happened, that he had done this to them. And they were laying in ambush for him. And they came out and approached him, and they were in a violent mood. So he suggested that they draw a quick ring on the ground. And they settled this with their fists. And they agreed. So he had 2 of them laid out flat, and the 3rd one was running down the trail, trying to get away. In the meantime, he went kneeling beside the other 2, bathing their wounds and preaching to them about the evils of fighting. And apparently, it is said that that Sunday, those 2 were in his congregation to hear him speak. When he first came to Rossland, it's an interesting fact that he lived in a hotel, and he had his first services in the Opera House. And he soon realized that those were wasted monies, the rent of the Opera House and hotel. That money should be used for the desperate miners. There were so many people in need of help. So many people came there. Fortunes were won and lost overnight, and people were, there was no social safety net. There was a lot of misery, and that was where he really focused his work, was on the people who needed his help. So he gave up those digs and lived in a shack for a long time until he finally was able to get enough money raised to build a small church, and then his rooms were in the basement. And even his own living room he turned into a free library and reading room for the people. And, but you'll remember also that this story started in 1901 as he was heading back to Montreal. He reached Montreal. He didn't get all the way to Ireland. He had taken his superior's advice and decided to go back, but it's thought that he was not only tired and weakened, but maybe his mental faculties were beginning to be a little bit impaired perhaps by 15 years in the saddle, I don't know. But it is also said that he just went for a walk one evening outside of Montreal. It was late 1901, winter, and he was used to the relatively mild winters of BC. He didn't realize how cold winter was there, and he ended up spending the night outside. And the next morning, a local farmer saw this man trudging down the road, more pushing and pulling his feet than walking with them, and took him to a doctor, and turned out, and he wasn't dressed in garb that would indicate that he was a priest. He was dressed in his civvies. And the doctor saw that the injuries were extremely serious. His feet were badly frozen, and he was very sick. And they sent him to Notre Dame Hospital there, and the nursing sisters gave him really good care. And they said later that some of them were crying when they saw the pain in his feet as the thawing, as his feet came back to sensitivity after being frozen. And he said that their tears caused him more pain than pain in his feet. He was such a heartfelt person. And he realized that his time was nearing the end. So he confided in the doctor. He gave him all his papers and letters and asked him to take care of his final affairs. And he died there in that hospital in 1902, January of 1902. And his body was sent back to be buried beside his wife and child in Westminister. And when the people of Rossland, where he had been minister for 4 or 5 years, when they heard that he had died, they immediately had a fundraising effort. And what they did with the money was they created or bought an ambulance. It was the Father Pat ambulance. So even after his death, he was still helping the miners in need. This ambulance would take them, an injured miner, perhaps to the clinic or to the hospital there. And the miners themselves, they also created a monument. And they built a monument out of ore from all of the mines, the War Eagle and the Leroy and the Center Star and the Josie and the Idaho, all the mines of Rossland. They built a monument made from all the different ores of all the mines. But probably the most touching monument to him was a fountain and lamp, which the city erected in downtown Rossland. And I forget what the plaque reads, but the idea behind the fountain and lamp was that it was the light of love by which he lived and the water of life which he so freely gave. And that's my story about Father Kennedy.